And Paul said we had the sentence of death upon ourselves so that we would learn that we can't. So that we wouldn't trust in ourselves, but we would trust God. Do you ever think about the fact, 2 Corinthians chapter number 1, that God has let you go through some things that were very, very hard. One, so that he would comfort you in your trouble so you could comfort other people in their trouble. And that God let us go through some things that we just thought, there's no way out of this thing, so that we would learn not to trust in ourselves, but to trust in God. Well, that's what this is all about. We're cast down. Things are really bad, but we're not. We're not in despair. We're not forsaken. We're not. Things are really hard and death works in us, Paul writes, but life working in you. Paul said, number 3, but though our outward man perishes, he said, our inward man is renewed day by day. And he said this light affliction, it's but for a moment, but it's working in us. It's growing us. It's maturing us. It's equipping us. And then when you get to verse number 18, and I'm almost done, he writes, while we look not at things which are seen, and number 5 is but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, they're temporary, he writes, but the things which are not seen, those are the things, Paul writes, they are the eternal things. I ran across a great quote from a commentator by the name of Albert Barnes, and he said these words: if we look directly at our trial, if the mind is fixed wholly on them, if we look, he said, directly at our trials, if our mind is fixed wholly on them, and if we think of nothing else, they often appear to be heavy and long. That's true, isn't it? You get focused on that, and the devil loves to get us focused on negative things, the bad things. We can have 100 good things going on in our life, and yet that one negative bad thing, and we just can't seem to quit thinking of it. And we get so wholly focused on it. And when Barnes writes, when we get so wholly focused on something that we can't seem to get our mind off of it, he writes that it seems to be heavy and long. He says even comparatively light and brief sufferings will appear to be exceedingly difficult to bear if all we can sit around and let ourselves think about that thing all the time. He says, but if we can turn away the mind from them and contemplate future glory. That's what he's talking about. Paul's talking about in verse 18. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen, they're temporary, they're temporal. But the things which are not seen, those are the things that are eternal. Barnes says if we can just turn our focus off on eternal things, on heaven, on how good heaven's going to be, if we can get our mind on the Lord, looking up, forsake thee. And we have the promise that all things, he didn't say all things that happen to us are good, but he says all things work together for good, right? And so even in the midst of all these difficult things, and it's easy to turn on the news, there are times I just turn the news off, and I like watching conservative news, but man, they just get so hyper-focused on negativity and bad things that there are times I got to just quit staring, I got to quit looking at it. Because no matter what happens, he that's in me, greater is he that's in me than he that's in. Right? And this is what Paul's talking about. He's like, we look not at things which are seen, but at things which are not seen. He's like, when the 5th thing, eaten and stoned, and he calls it light affliction. How could he do that? Because he didn't sit around and stare and let his mind be wholly occupied with the hard things. And if we can turn our mind tonight to think about the goodness of heaven, to think about how this light affliction, it's but for a moment. This will pass. If we can exceeding great and precious promises, partakers of the divine nature, and divine nature, God can be asleep on a boat in the midst of a storm. And when we are partakers of the divine nature, and when the mind of Christ, when we begin to think like Jesus, and I leave you with this thought. James Barnes said, people don't act like